Thank you, Kundan, and a very good day to all those who have joined this webinar today. I would like to start by thanking Mukti for inviting me to this wonderful venture Harvard is working on. And today, I hope to discuss some of the best practices that I have used during my years of craft documentation. I've been asked to speak about best practices, and as in all ethnographic research, I think the most important thing is really to think on your feet and adapt to situations as and when they arise. Having said that, a basic framework for research is always useful. I will try to suggest during this conversation the broad guidelines for documentation and share some of the ideas which have worked for me through my years of research in the craft sector. I'll begin by talking a little bit about handicrafts in general, which constitute a part of the cultural and creative industry in India. India as a country has a richness and diversity of cultural and craft heritage. It is important to safeguard and document this heritage to make this accessible for present and future generations. As vehicles of cultural uniqueness, they play an important role in nurturing the cultural diversity of the nation. They also aid in employment growth and income generation in the country. We also see that Indian designers in the 21st century and many more internationally use handicrafts in one form or another while producing fashion apparel and textiles both for use in India and for purposes of export. Fashion in India is largely inspired from the rich legacy of textiles and embellishments which have flourished in the country for thousands of years. The amalgamation of the traditional and the contemporary has created a new aesthetic which has a unique identity of its own. In India, we've had skilled practitioners practicing diverse arts and crafts for centuries, and they have helped to carry forward a lineage in almost an unbroken continuum. Along with just the artistry of the craft, the Indian handloom and handicraft industry also demonstrates to India and to the world the richness and the diversity of Indian culture. That's because culture and things that we used which were produced by hand were so closely linked to each other. Very broadly, I've used a classification here to classify craftspersons into two categories. The first being professional craftspersons, and they practice what is like hereditary craft, which means that the craft belongs to individual communities, and these people they carry forward the occupation of their families by producing products for local consumption and to some extent for trade and for barter also. The second category of craftspersons who are not really non-professionals or amateurs, but that's how I've classified them because they are very skilled in the work that they do. But this group largely comprises of women who create traditional products for domestic and personal use and for use in rituals. So really these are people who would traditionally not have contributed to the economics of the craft. When we start talking about documenting crafts, it really involves a multi-pronged approach because we are dealing with issues which link together different disciplines like sociology, psychology, religion, culture, economics, and many others. As I've mentioned earlier, craft practices in India were inextricably linked with social customs and rituals over centuries. Crafts were bound into the matrix of magic and mystery associated with rituals, and many products were crafted specifically for use in rituals. That's a quote by Stella Kremrich. With contemporary lifestyles leading to extreme modifications in the way of living, many of the customs and rituals have vanished, and along with this, the crafts too have been rendered obsolete and their existence almost imperiled. Traditionally, the products made were utilitarian and form and function were closely related. As lifestyles have changed, so have products. I'll give you a few simple examples which I'm sure all of us are familiar with. One of the first is that of a tawa or a cooking pan, which was made of clay and baked. And today it stands almost completely replaced with an iron skillet. Another example is the matka or the clay pot, which was used to store water and kept it cool. The same has now been replaced with plastic buckets or pots or the refrigerator. And some of these changes we have seen in our own generation. Since the process of documentation touches the lives of respondents very closely, the researchers have to have an extremely sensitive approach to the process and tread carefully to elicit the correct responses from the respondents, who in most cases are the artisans. One must also ensure that questions which often touch their personal lives are put forth appropriately without getting anybody upset or getting their shackles up. The preliminary study and secondary research before going to the field thus becomes extremely important. It helps the researcher to develop an understanding of the people and the region which he would be working with. Literature review, other possible sources of information which are so essential in any research, thus have a place of great significance in documenting craft. Published and unpublished literature in various journals, craft documents done by organizations, survey reports of various government bodies help us to understand about the craft and the socio-cultural context. Unfortunately, the data that is available to us in this sector is hugely scattered. And though some attempts have been made by organizations like CRT, Dastakar, where we can get details of artisans, etc., largely it's a struggle to find information. Artisan details, which are available through many of these resources, form a base for ethnographic research. The secondary study of the craft based on literature review, the visuals that are available, videos, discussions with other scholars and experts are thus extremely important and essential. This helps us in planning of time schedules in the field. It helps us to formulate data collection tools. It helps us to make our interview schedules, questionnaires, and so on and so forth. A detailed study of the region and the terrain, which would include climate, geography, accessibility, etc., also needs to be done before the fieldwork is started. And I'll give you one of the earlier examples of this which I faced. I had to go to Jodhpur, to a village near Jodhpur, to do some study on dress that I was working with. And we asked some local people if a vehicle would go there. And they assured us that yes, they would travel to the field every day in a vehicle. So in those days, the Maruti 800 used to be the common mode of transport, and we sat in that and we went to the village, little realizing that the vehicle that our contact had been talking about was the local bus that went there. And sure enough, our car got stuck in the sand dunes much before we ever reached the village. So it would have been important to have a greater study of that region. In another case, while I was doing my doctoral work, I had gone to a village near Barmer, in fact about 100 kilometers from Barmer. And belonging to Rajasthan, I was very confident that I knew the local language and that would never be a issue for me. Once I reached this remote village, I realized that the local dialect that the people were speaking was very, very different. And it was like being in a foreign land. I didn't understand their language. They didn't understand my language. But again, I had to think on my feet because I'd already spent considerable amount of time and money in reaching that village. And we used the services of our drivers who helped us to bridge some of the gaps. In some regions, when you're working near border regions or you're working near tribal belts and special regions, you need permissions which to actually visit the areas. And again, when I was doing my work in Barmer, the Chawton area, a lot of permissions are needed because those are border areas of the country. So it also then becomes important to make a connect and inform the local authorities before actually going into the field. Having tie-ups with organizations which are working in the region also gather significance. And once when I was working with a group of people, I went to the local Nehru Yuva Kendra, and just the staff of that village, of that organization, including the person who was the guard, the person who was serving water, they were a more vital source of information for me than perhaps many other resources could have been. And of course, the organization itself helped me to connect with many remote villages where I could go and collect my data. While we are collecting the data on craft practice, again we find that multiple levels of information needs to be sought, and a multi-pronged approach has to be taken. Complete understanding of the craft can only be gained by having discussions not only with the artisans but with different stakeholders who are involved in the craft. So it could be the buyer of the craft, it could be the user of the product. For example, when one is doing costume studies, so it is of course important to interview the communities who wear the costumes, but also equally important then to talk to the tailor who makes the garment, to the printer who prints the fabric, to the weaver who weaves the fabric, and to other people, other communities, as to what their understanding of that color or that print or that motif or other style might be, to really get a holistic understanding of what this costume means in that social context. And while we are studying such issues like the dress of a people, it becomes important to appreciate that we are intruding upon people and their lifestyles and their work practices, and to be extremely sensitive to these issues. One of the things I always like to tell my students is that remember that we are going to the field because it is our requirement, it is our need, and we should be in a learning mode and have an humble attitude, so that we can talk to the artisans or to the people we want information from a level of a taker, not a giver, and a taker who doesn't have really a right to that information but as a request to that information. And having a rapport with the artisans and ensuring that we can get the maximum information really makes the time spent in the field of good value. So initially when we go into the field, it's a good practice in the first few days to observe and build an understanding of the practice. And of course, this will depend largely upon the amount of time that we have in the field. A non-participatory observation helps to understand the phenomena of observing the craft and community involved while staying separate from their actual activities. Doing video logging and photography gives us a scope to revisit the data collected and the reflections by researcher at a later stage when data is being analyzed. Initial observation is often descriptive, in which researchers carry out broad scope observation to get an overview of the setting. Using these multiple data collection techniques or tools becomes fundamental to documenting crafts, as it reduces observer bias in interpretation. The researchers' extensive fieldwork, employment of multiple data sources, and observation methods, and responsible behavior in field are few strategies that can reduce the above impact of biases that I just talked about. Interpretive analysis goes hand in hand with data collection, and observation starts to get more focused. in which attention is paid to a narrow portion of the activities. Case studies of crafts may be undertaken through an extensive documentation review, electronic correspondence, and by using personal interviews. The case study would start with a stakeholder's problem through secondary data, highlight the solution, and then we should be able to quantify the results that we get from this exercise. I'm going to talk about one of the projects that I had worked with a few years back. And this was a project on defining the parameters of languishing crafts. To do this project, I had to actually study some of the languishing crafts and first to identify the languishing crafts, and then to study them in some detail, and then try to analyze what were the common parameters that would help us to define languishing crafts. And the reason for doing this was that the government is attempting to protect crafts which are languishing, and at the same time they did not know how to define a languishing craft. So they needed strict parameters by which they could identify these particular crafts. So the research project studied 30 crafts in India which belonged to this category. So really, to begin with, we had to identify a larger number of crafts, study them, and then once the parameters were defined, we could go back and say some of these fell under the category of languishing. Coming finally to revisit the steps for documentation, which include both the primary and secondary research. So the first thing, looking at the history of the craft, which would include the origin of the craft, the location, the historical facts, and taking the example of Ajrak printing. So for the primary research, studying books which have been written by authors such as Nurja Bilgrami and Lotika Vardarajan, which detail the craft documentation and printing techniques. Ajrak printing said to have dated back to early medieval times and probably originated in Western India and Sindh, which is in present-day Pakistan. Trying to understand what the initial purpose of the craft is. So why the craft started, what problems did it resolve, under what circumstances and conditions was it used. And Ajrak in Arabic literally means blue. It is likened to a moonless sky at midnight with stars sparkling in the darkness. It was developed to be worn by Muslims during celebrations and reflected the heavens above. The cultural context is also important to study. So understanding the details of the founding community, whether it was male or female dominated, whether it was a family occupation, whether it was a local orientation, among other things. And if we take again the example of Ajrak, the printing started with practice by Muslim communities, and the entire family would take part in the long process of printing Ajrak. Practiced on a small scale, it was passed from one generation to the other. Also looking at any other factors which are typical to the craft, and coming to talking about the Ajrak in Barmer in India, where the craft is also practiced, we find that the fabric promotes inter-community harmony. The Ajrak fabric printed by Hindus and used mostly among the Muslim communities, whereas the fabric which was used by Hindu women, not in Ajrak, but was made by Muslim communities. The second thing that we talk about are the process and techniques. So detailing the entire steps of the process, and each process bifurcated stepwise along with the end result of the step. So for example, in Ajrak, which is a multiple step resist printing and dyeing process, each step, like Bhatna, which prints the resist outline, is to be detailed during documentation. Also to draw out a time and action plan, keeping in mind various seasons and festivals in mind. Specifically for Ajrak, one of the findings is that it is best done in hot temperatures because the time consumed is less, and also it is said to give brighter colors during the warm temperatures. If there are any geographical significances of any of the steps, and in Ajrak we find that the dyeing and printing is done in certain specific water bodies, because the mineral content of the water is said to give distinct colors which would only come in certain regions. The third thing that we need to then study is the tools and materials that are used. So tools used at all different stages of the process, their making, the preparations required, etc. And again, in the case of ajrak, how are the blocks made, what type of wood is used, what type of special skills are needed to make the three types of negative, positive and filling blocks which are made for the same design. Apart from the blocks that are used in ajrak, the different types of paste, the wooden printing beds, etc. also need to be analyzed. Then making a list of different types of materials, where they are sourced from, what their pricing is. So figuring all of those issues out, and ajrak then trying to understand where the indigo, the pomegranate seed, the alizarin, the local flowers that are used during the dyeing, where are these sourced from? How do the artisans maintain these tools? Again, that has to be documented. And the blocks, containers, sponges, which are carefully washed and dried each time they are used, because the blocks are used sometimes for generations on end. The fourth thing that I would say is studying the importance of motifs and symbolism. So identifying what are old motifs, what are new motifs, what their names were. Again, as I said earlier, finding out about the names is extremely tricky, because people will just call things by a common name. So a flower will be just a flower, whereas actually each flower would traditionally have a specific name and a form. So in ajrak, the classic ancient motifs used are kharak, and the variations of which represented different constellations. And understanding each type of kharak then becomes important when we are talking about the printing technique. Identifying also what are new motifs, what are other motifs that have been added, what could be the reasons for these new motifs to be added, from which type of art have they been borrowed, how have they been adapted into the printing technique, all become essential in the printing and in the documentation process. The symbolic meaning of all motifs again is indigenous to each craft and useful for us to understand. For instance, in the ajrak, layouts are the integral part of the printing technique, and they will actually determine the type of product which will be made. For instance, in the chador, the central jal is always printed, and the printing is done from inside out. The contemporary context of the craft is also useful for us to understand when we are studying. So for instance, what type of new methods have been taken up in recent times, why they have arisen. So in ajrak, obviously from natural to the usage of more synthetic dyes, the usage of screen printing in addition to the block printing that is done. Then understanding the cultural, geographical and economic context in making craft in current times. The usage and popularity, which means what is the relevance of the craft in modern times and popular context. And recently there was a big, big controversy when a designer used in one of the products that he made, which was a digitally printed jacket. He said inspired by ajrak, and the prints that he was using were skulls. And there was a huge uproar among the ajrak printers communities. The technique thus continues to be relevant in modern times, but the end product for which it is used has changed for the modern consumer. So the objective of the study was to create economic sustainability of the traditional means of livelihood for artisans. Due to the lack of awareness, appreciation and patronage to these artisans, many of them were lost to mechanical jobs in different types of industry. An ethnographic approach was thus adopted for this longitudinal study, which was done across 6 geographical regions in the country. A number of crafts were explored in the different regions, and 5 crafts in this category were finally identified from each area for a detailed study. Data collection for this qualitative study was done through secondary sources and primary research. Questionnaires and interview schedules, which were both structured and unstructured, were administered to artisans and other experts working in the craft sector to generate the primary data. Observations were done both at the artisan's home and at work, and we used both film and audio recordings, which helped us to support our data collection. The information was verified uh, at different levels, and data was collected both from government and non-government organizations, and many experts were actually involved in this study. Finally, we did content analysis of the data, and after documentation of the data, the final parameters were presented to the government of India, and these have now been adopted, and these parameters are actually used to identify languishing crafts in the country. Each craft that we studied was under different heads. We talked about the history, the origin and social context, the raw materials used, the tools and equipments employed, the process of production, product range that was developed, what were the changes in craft practice, what were the approximate number of artisans working with the craft, and a detailed interpretive analysis of the data was obtained from studying all the crafts. The data was collected at multiple levels through interviews, questionnaires, and observations, and was analyzed collectively. This interpretive approach, which was based on knowledge and previous experience of the researcher, helped us in formulating the parameters. And the parameters evaluated and defined the languishing crafts. They were also useful to determine the status and the performance of craft categories in domestic and international market, and these also suitably reflect on the socio-economic conditions of all related practicing stakeholders. The knowledge of the techniques, designs, etc., and the understanding of issues facing the craft and the craftspersons became important to take policy decisions about languishing crafts. And before I come in detail to about the value of documenting crafts as I see it, I'd just like to say that this project that was done was a build-up on another project that I had done almost 5 to 6 years before on product development of one languishing craft. And when later when we were analyzing this, we realized that there were no clear definitions. So just by documenting and doing some work on one craft, we found that there were no details available about the actual main languishing craft as a term. So I'm going to now talk about some of the commercial aspects which come to my mind of the value of documentation. And I've used some examples and some ideas in this presentation, but I'm sure there are many, many more benefits of documentation processes, and I'll be happy to hear from people who are listening on to this and build together the details of such benefits. So obviously, the documentation creates an awareness among producers and consumers about different facets of practice, and this creates a need and an interest of the craft that is being documented and talked about. I'm going to just talk about one of the crafts that I have done to start with here, and one of these was Barrack Printing, and which is a relatively lesser known printing technique. And before I go on to explain about the actual benefits of this, a little bit about gold printing. The printing of gold and silver on textiles can be divided into distinct categories, and two of the techniques that are well known are khadi, which uses metallic dust for printing, and Barrack, which uses the application of gold or silver leaf. I do believe that the Varrock is the older of the two techniques, often also used in many of the painted textiles that painted products that are produced in the country. Barrack printing is not as popular as it once was, though there is a renewed interest in it currently. Ornamentation with this specialized technique is expensive and was always expensive and could be afforded only by royalty and the elite. Like many indigenous crafts, it lost much of its patronage during colonial rule. Though there has been an attempt to revive the craft today, only a few artisans still practice the technique. The process begins with the preparation of the adhesive paste, which includes a fine white powder, a resin, or a saresh. Both are heated to their melting point and then mixed and strained in order to remove any particles and impurities and to make a uniform viscous paste. Ready-made paste, which has a longer shelf life, is also available in the market and has started to be used as an alternate. The printing paste is spread on a printing pad, which is a piece of blanket in a tray, and the block is pressed gently on the paste and then stamped onto the fabric to imprint the design on its surface. The Varrock is now applied onto this sticky surface with a small pad in the shape of a small little pouch of muslin which is filled with cotton wool, onto which it adheres, and after the complete design has been covered with it, a soft hand brush removes all residual Varrock. Finally, the cloth is burnished with a rolling pin attached with an agate stone and imparts a beautiful glossy sheen through the gold and silver Varrock which is applied on the fabric. Once I published this book, which I've done in my book on costumes and textiles of Rajasthan, I received many different calls from designers, from companies, and they wanted to learn more about the craft, and they sought an introduction to the artisans who were practicing it. Some of the designers, I'm happy to say, have been doing experimentation on how to make this paste better, because traditionally the paste, the printing is such that it washes off, and one of the reasons for that could be that the products that it was made on was only used once when the bride got married. So there was no reason for the product to be ever washed. It was mostly kept in storage. So not only did I hear from designers and companies, and I continue to receive calls on this, the artisans themselves with whom I shared the final work, and I went and showed Devilalji Chipa, who's no more today, where his picture was printed, and he felt such a great sense of pride, and he invited everybody in his local area to show them that his picture had got printed. And I think they felt a sense that the work that they were doing was so important and unique that it was being shared with the world at large. One of the outcomes, I like to believe, that today his grandson and his granddaughter both are practicing the craft. Such documentation thus helps to make people feel recognized and may become an incentive for future generations to continue with the practice. A work I do as an academic who works in the craft sector is to consolidate and bring together bits of information which are sometimes only faintly in people's memories. As we know, a lot of craft practice and intangible knowledge is unwritten, and often the practitioners themselves may not be aware of information on the same. This is very true. This is very relevant also to cultural knowledge. If I were to ask my mother why she was doing a particular ritual, she would never have an answer for that. She would just say, "Oh, we've always done this." It's only when you ask the question in many times and in many different forms that you realize that this is the reason why a particular ritual is done, or why a particular puja is performed in the house, or why a particular color is worn. So the practitioner himself does not know the reason for the reasons, and also does not know that he has the information in his own mind. And these, when as researchers we collect, we analyze, we compile, they become important pieces of knowledge and information. Designers and entrepreneurs can then use this knowledge and making it an integral part of their work, and carrying forward bits of knowledge from over the years. Um, One of the things that I did for my PhD was I studied the dress of women in Rajasthan in the Thar Desert Belt, specifically in the Rajasthan Belt. And this ethnographic study had at its core the objective of documenting women's garments in Rajasthan. For various social and cultural reasons, every community in India sought to express its identity in terms of its clothing. This type of dressing led to prolonged periods of vogue of certain materials and dressing styles, and led to the establishment of what today we call tradition. From what is available in the living practices today, one could form some idea about the general aesthetic and social considerations that might have played a role in fashioning women's garments among different social groups. A study of costume thus provides an index to the social, cultural, political, historical, and economic aspects that shaped its people and its ethos. One important section, which I feel was very important, I published, was devoted to patterns of typologically selected garments, which were discussed in the book. This inclusion of this section not only enhanced the book's documentary value, but provided the reader with an opportunity to revive and use some of these traditional garments in the present times. The patterns, I believe, also serve as valuable archives and reference materials for students of fashion technology. The information I collected was by studying collections of women who had them kept in their trunks, by discussions with different tailors, by visiting people's homes, by studying the photographs that were presented to me. And I actually worked with tailors who worked with different communities and helped created clothes for men and women of these different communities. And once I came home, using my knowledge of pattern making and garment construction, I pulled the garments apart, and then I started to study how the patterns had actually been made, and what type of seams that people were using. And I made an analysis of all of these, and then created patterns for each of these garments. This collection became a reserve of knowledge. And one of my designer friends told me that she was going to wear out the appendix of her book, because she used it so often for understanding patterns when she was doing her creative work. Another very important thing that we do as documenters is, again, what I was talking about, the building up repertoire of knowledge. So documenting motifs and their symbolisms is, again, very, very important, and it can be used both by the artisans and by designers while creating their collections. And if we look at books which have been done by British scholars, I think they were all very fascinated by the shikarga motif. And in many different books, the shikarga motif appears again and again, whether in a shawl or in a carpet or in a embroidered piece of fabric. And because it was so often used, today it is a very rich source of inspiration for designers, and we see it again and again in saris and shawls and fabrics from different regions where traditionally it might never have been also used. Documentation can also help us to influence policy and bring about changes which help an artisan and assist craft enterprises. It is also important for us to engage with today's consumer, and this trend, I do believe, is likely to grow in the future. There is an increasing awareness of sustainability and products which have a social and environmental priority. And one of the leading forecasts and my observation of recent times has been that consumers are placing an increased value on the experiences or meaning associated with the product rather than on the materiality of the item itself. So the story of the maker or the making adds an intangible value to the product, which makes it unique and very desirable to the customer. In the craft sector, experience is enhanced by documentation of the craft and the story, which is so real. So talking about the story of the artisan, where he comes from, how he creates this product, what are the processes that are used, what are the changes that have happened. I think that connect is very important for a consumer, and we can actually increase the sales of craft products by connecting these stories of the artisans with the consumer. Documentation is the first step that is taken for geographical indications. A GI is a sign used on goods that have a specific geographical origin and possess qualities or reputation that are due to their place of origin. The artisan thus can enjoy exclusivity in the marketplace and protect themselves against machine-made products and products which claim to have the same qualities but may be made in another region. In a new collaborative environment, the key is to understand and appreciate different points of views, and knowledge of craft can help us to create and provide these platforms. As reality is qualified, altered, and commercialized, consumers respond to what is engaging, personal, and memorable, and above all, authentic. And documentation of craft surely helps us to achieve that objective. Thank you.
Like if I hear Bandhani, then I will write it the way I hear it, and not as not my own interpretation or an English interpretation of the word. So, and some things I do, like a double I will use as a. So if it's a a ki matra, then I will use a double a. If it is j, then I will use a j. So I write it as I hear it, if that answers the question.
So I will read out a question by Mr. Amarnath who had posted earlier. His question, there are two questions. How do you define a dying craft? And the next one is, can an artisan have the right on the research papers published? Are there any copyright issues in that?
So the project that I had done to define a languishing craft, unfortunately the name is so depressing, this dying craft, that we had suggested that the government should use the term precious crafts or endangered crafts to define these crafts. But what we had done was we set out two sets of parameters, and we said that there would be some basic parameters and there would be some secondary parameters. And for a craft to fall into the languishing craft category, all the basic parameters should be met and some of the secondary parameters should be met. So for instance, the number of craft practitioners should be less than 25. The reduction in time spent on the particular craft, if that was more than 50% in the past 3 years, then it could be a languishing craft. And if the next generation in family was not wanting to adopt the craft, then these became the basic parameters. And then similarly, we had laid out 6 to 8 secondary parameters, and any two out of that, if the craft fulfilled, then that craft would be in conjunction with the basic parameters we defined as a languishing craft. The other question I think is a little bit more tricky, where you say that does the artisan have the right to the documentation that one has done? And I think those matters should be, in this day of IPR and GIs, should be clarified at a very early stage of the research, where you establish that, if you are going to, who the knowledge belongs to and who has the right to sort of publish those kind of information. We always encourage, if our students are doing research, to put the pictures and the names of the artisans whom they have spoken to, and that in some way gives them some right. But of course, with geographical indications, it is becoming almost the knowledge is becoming the property of the groups of artisans who set out to actually take the GIs. Thank you.
The next question is by Maya Kerkar. So Maya, I'm unmuting you. You could please proceed and ask your question.
Hello, Vandana ji. I just heard a word like Shikargar motif.
Yes.
What is this Shikargar motif?
Okay, so the Shikarga motive is a motive where, when in olden times, when royalty would go out to actually, for shikar, literally. So it's like a jungle scene. So it's a man, the king is riding on a horse, or he has his own group of people who are riding on a horse, and there would be trees, there would be lions and cheetahs and elephants and snakes and, all kind of animals. So it's like a jungle scene, but it's essentially translates literally to a hunting scene. And we see that in carpets, we see that these beautiful motifs in shawls, on wall paintings, and in many other forms.
The next question is by Mr. Shishir Das.
Hi, Dr. Vandana.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
I am Shishir Das from Tata. I am Shishir Das from Tata Trust.
Yes.
Thank you for such an enlightening discussion. I just want to add one thing that now, because of the younger generation are much more interested about the digital documentation. So what strategy we should adopt to create awareness among these younger generation to having their to considering their interest for the digital documentation?
You mean younger generation of artisans or younger generation of documenters?
Documenters.
Documenters.
Documenters as well as the readers or as well as the audiences. Yeah.
Yes, I think today definitely it is the age of digital documentation and everything digital. So even in a classroom situation, as Kundan had mentioned, I'm a faculty at NIFT. And even in a classroom situation, we find that students are much more excited when we show them a video or when we show them something, on YouTube, as opposed to actually physically showing them in books, etc. So if we use a lot of audio-visual aids for our documentation, then it is definitely more interactive for a younger audience, to see. And even when they are documenting, the use of digital cameras, the use of putting everything online has become the new medium for documentation.
The next question which Chinmay Subhash couldn't ask, I'll just repeat the question on our behalf. How and where does one access this kind of documentation? For example, if I want to know more about the Gulegudda Khanna in northern Karnataka, where will and how will I know what has been previously documented so that there is no duplication?
Okay, so as I mentioned, it is hard to find a repository of all documentation that has been done. Even we as documenters, we document so many things and they are not published, so they become, it's difficult for people to access. What I always start by doing is, as we just talked about digital, go on the internet and start to search people who have worked in that area. There will be something or the other that will come, either a book or a paper or a video, something would appear of that particular craft. You can also visit libraries, look at the different types of books that have been written, talk to senior crafts people not crafts persons actually, but people who are working in the craft sector, and they would also be able to help in connecting to the type of information that may already be available on these.
The next question is by Shruti Mittal. Should every social enterprise document the craft which it works with? Also, there are several hundreds of motifs per craft. How does one document all of these? And are the motifs the property of only one artisan or the entire community? That is, can a designer use the motifs and give it to any artisan in the community?
So you've talked about how much should a social enterprise document? In my view, we can never document enough. If we are just documenting motives, we are not doing justice to the people. If we are just documenting the symbolism, we are still not doing justice. So everything that we do should be documented, because these things are slipping through our hands like sand. And the more we document, the more we can retain. As far as property of artisans go, I think this is a collective heritage. And unless somebody is very specific about not sharing motives, we can actually go ahead and share, because these are common. This is something which has come to us through generations. However, when people are creating contemporary designs and bringing about change in the design, then we need to respect their right to privacy.
The next question is by Jonali Saikia.
Hello, Vandana.
Hello.
And thank you, Kundan. Thank you, Vandana, for a very enlightening discussion. I just wanted to ask, about a word that we hear very often, and especially in this era when we are seeing a resurgence of crafts. And before that, let me quickly introduce myself. I work particularly and specifically with Northeastern weavers. I'm trying to create new products which are based on the local traditional motif and weaving traditions of the Northeastern region. And my organization name is called HIA. So my question is that, we hear of this word called revival very often. And, it seems like a very elitist word at times, because we hear, revival, so-and-so is reviving this and that. So I was just wondering, what really constitutes revival? Is it revival from an economic sense? For example, if someone had, woven, or weavers were used to weaving something earlier, and now, and now it is not being woven anymore, and or does it, and therefore, customers cannot buy them in the market, or is it about, the fact that it is, just gone? I mean, no one sees any more of that motif anymore, and maybe just one or two pieces are lying somewhere in a museum or in someone's, trunk at home. So what really is revival? So I think, you get the context of my question.
Yes, I do, Denali, thank you. Of course, this can have different connotations for different people, but to me, revival really means continuation of practice, because it's not as if we are, it's totally died and gone and then we are working with it. It's a weaver who has discontinued the practice. It's a weaver who may have moved to a different type of yarn. It's a weaver who may have started making different type of colors, and because we have collated some knowledge, we have looked at a museum piece or a piece in the trunk, and we have recreated it and ensured a kind of a sustenance to that product, which means that we are also giving some economic value to that product so that that person can continue to create it. I think that becomes like a revival.
The next question is by Shweta Dariwal.
Hi, you mentioned earlier that there were the parameters that you have devised, or that the team has devised for defining dyeing craft and all that. So are these parameters available for public use? How does one access?
I think they are on the Ministry of Textiles website, and also they should be on the Planning Commission website.
The next question is by Hemendra Sharma. Do you advise a single book or multiple books which have recorded much of the Indian craft and could be referred to broadening the understanding of craft?
Well, I think one single book would be, it would have to be an encyclopedia, like a Britannica encyclopedia, to really cover all the crafts. But the two people who seem to have managed to put in a huge amount of data and information are Aditi Ranjan and the late MP Ranjan in the book Handmade in India. So I think that's really a brilliant book and a very good read for and a quick reference for different crafts. But of course, if we want to study about the entire details and the processes and all of that, then individual books become quite useful.
So that was the last question which we would be taking due to constraint of time. Thank you, Dr. Vandana, for this very good presentation on documentation of crafts in the sector. And we also thank all the participants for joining us this evening. Thank you so much and good evening.